Ryan stood trembling in the glow of Christmas lights, 16 and cornered in his Ohio living room, the air thick with pine and cinnamon. The family's annual party buzzing around him, cousins laughing, aunts passing cookies, a tree twinkling in the corner. A confession at Christmas turned his world to ash. He'd come out, voice shaking, "I'm gay," to a room that froze, forks clinking against plates, his dad's face darkening. A devout man whose Bible sat worn on the mantle, his mom's eyes dropping to the floor, silent as stone. "You're no son of mine!" his dad roared, voice booming over the carols, a thunderclap that silenced the chatter. Heads turning, eyes boring into Ryan, a boy unraveling before them all, his truth a bomb no one caught, his heart pounding as the room spun, a holiday shattered in seconds. His dad didn't pause, grabbing Ryan's arm, dragging him through the crowd, past the stunned aunts, the wide-eyed kids, to the front door. "Get out!" a snarl, flinging his coat and a duffel into the snow, the porch light casting a harsh beam, the door slamming, lock clicking, a wall rising where home once stood. His mom stayed back, arms crossed, lips tight, not a word, not a glance. Her silence a knife, sharper than his dad's wrath, siding with the man who'd erased her son. Aunt Linda stepped up. "This isn't right, John," her voice firm, but his dad spun. "Stay out of it or don't come back." A decree that hushed her, her face falling, a lifeline snuffed, leaving Ryan alone, the cold biting his skin, the party's hum fading behind glass, a family feast he'd never taste again. He stumbled into the night, snow crunching under his sneakers, breath fogging in the chill, the duffel a weight on his shoulder, his coat thin against the wind, tears freezing on his cheeks as he reached a park bench, its wood icy, his bed now. He sat, the town glowing with lights he'd hung with them, the warmth he'd lost, a boy disowned for being himself, 16 and homeless, the jingle of bells a cruel echo, his world shrinking to a single seat in the dark. They'd been his everything, his dad's stern nods, his mom's quiet meals, a life he'd thought safe until that night. That word tore it all away, a rejection raw and public, a wound opened before kin, a Christmas he'd never forget, a family with no room for him. If Ryan's icy exile cuts you deep, stick with us. Hit that like, share this with someone cast out, and subscribe to Heart Stories. We're here for the disowned. Join us. Tap that bell. Ryan woke to a dawn that cut like glass, shivering on that park bench in the Ohio chill. The Christmas snow crusting his coat into a stiff shell, his breath puffing white in the gray light. The town's festive hum, a bitter jab after his family's rejection. A 16-year-old with nowhere left, his duffel a soggy heap beside him, his stomach a gnawing pit. Disowned for being gay, he'd been thrown out his dad's roar, his mom's silence, a door locked tight, and now the streets owned him. Days melting into weeks, scavenging greasy fries from diner bins, hands numb from the cold's bite, feet blistered in sneakers that squished with every step. A boy adrift in a world that turned its back, a life teetering on the edge of nothing. He'd trudged to gas stations, motels, warehouses, voice cracking. "Got any work?" Only to hear, "Not for you, kid." Doors banging shut, faces twisting at his matted hair, his patched jacket, his quiet, "I'll sweep, I'll lift," met with, "You don't fit here." A rejection that mirrored that Christmas night, a wound torn wider with each cold stare, a teenager sinking into a void he couldn't name. He begged on corners, coins rattling in a cracked styrofoam cup, nights curled under bridges, the wind howling through his thin frame, hunger a relentless claw, doubt a heavier chain. Maybe they were right, maybe he was worthless. A thought that chewed him hollow, depression wrapping tight, sleep a fitful refuge on frozen concrete, his bones aching, his dreams a blur of snow and shouting. Months stretched, his body shrinking, his eyes dulling under a cap he'd scavenged, until one February evening, the cold biting deeper, he slumped against a coffee shop's brick wall, its neon sign flickering open, the warmth inside a tease, the chatter a hum he couldn't join. The door creaked, and the owner stepped out, a wiry man, Carl, gray streaking his beard, lines etched deep from his own hard years. "You're half dead, kid." His voice rough but warm, eyes piercing through the grime, the despair. "Get inside." A command Ryan followed, too weak to resist. The heat washing over him, the scent of roasted beans, a lifeline he hadn't known he'd craved, a stranger pulling him from the abyss. Carl was a gay man who'd fought his own wars, his shop a refuge on the town's frayed edge, walls plastered with faded photos, mismatched mugs dangling from hooks, a jukebox crooning Sinatra in the corner. He shoved a broom at Ryan. "Sweep, you eat." A deal with no softness. A chance Ryan seized, hands trembling as he dragged the bristles over sticky tiles. A bowl of potato soup his reward, steam curling up. His first real meal in weeks, the spoon clattering against his teeth, warmth seeping into his core. Carl watched, arms crossed, then tossed a threadbare blanket. "Backroom's yours, no trouble." A cot wedged between sacks of coffee beans, his new bed. The hum of a space heater, his lullaby. A roof where none had stood, a gift he didn't question. "You're not trash," Carl growled one night, pouring coffee. "I was you once, kicked out, left for dead." A confession that landed hard, a spark Ryan clutched. A man who'd been disowned now offering shelter. A crack of light in a life of slammed doors. A hand he'd never expected. He stayed, scrubbing counters, washing mugs, Carl's gruff lessons. "Chin up, kid, you're tougher than this." A tether he didn't know he'd needed, a steadiness he'd lost that snowy night. Days turned to weeks, and Carl slid an old laptop across the counter, its keys worn, screen scratched. Mess with it, a challenge Ryan took, fingers clumsy on the trackpad, eyes burning through free coding tutorials online. The glow, a beacon in the storeroom's dimness. Lines of code, his new tongue, a skill hammered out in sleepless hours. Cold coffee staining his shirt, a mind battling to prove he wasn't the nothing they'd branded him. Depression lingered, a fog whispering defeat, nights where he'd stare at the ceiling, the cot creaking, tears streaking silently. But he'd code through it, jaw clenched, hands shaking. Each error fixed a stone in a wall against despair. A boy who'd begged now, crafting, a dream flickering under Carl's roof, a chance no one else had dared give. Years rolled on, the cot his cradle, the shop his classroom, Carl's quiet grunts his fuel, a pride swelling slow as he mastered scripts, built apps, turned doubt into logic, a life clawing up from the gutter. He'd stand at the counter some mornings, dawn spilling gold through the grimy windows, Carl grinding beans behind him, the clink of mugs a steady beat, a home he'd stumbled into when every door had barred him, a man who'd seen him when his family hadn't, a start he'd gripped with chapped hands, a path he'd hacked alone, a strength they'd never fathom. A kid disowned now rising, one open door against a world of slams, a fight he'd wage without them. Ryan leaned back in a leather chair in his Columbus office at 25. The low hum of his startup, a steady heartbeat around him. 9 years since that snow-dusted bench, a universe apart from the boy who'd shivered through Christmas, his hands now firm on a sleek laptop he'd bought with his own cash. His name etched on a glass door that wasn't borrowed from Carl's goodwill. He'd built this outreach, an app connecting LGBTQ+ folks to jobs without judgment, born from restless nights in that coffee shop storeroom, from lines of code scratched out on a battered screen, from a fire stoked by every rejection, every slammed door, a vision he'd pounded into reality. A kid disowned, now standing tall, a life they'd never graze. The app exploded, downloads soaring past thousands, investors knocking, a lifeline for youth like he'd been frightened, forsaken, fierce, its logo glowing on phones from Cleveland to Cincinnati, then nationwide, a success he'd wrested from nothing, a triumph his family would never own, a legacy they'd never stain. The world took note, tech blogs hummed, outreach redefines inclusion, local stations aired pieces, from streets to stardom, his face plastered across flickering TVs, a young man in a tailored blazer, hair combed back, eyes bright with a gleam that masked the cracks, a story they devoured, a saga of grit they couldn't ignore. By year's end, Outreach cracked the top 10 social impact startups, a polished plaque on his desk. Innovator of the Year, the mayor gripping his hand at a glitzy gala, chandeliers casting light on his tie, cameras snapping, applause thundering through the ballroom, a roar that swallowed the echo of his dad's, "You're no son of mine," a moment he'd clawed toward, a peak they'd never glimpse. He'd linger late in his office, the city skyline twinkling beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, the app's stats climbing thousands employed, lives lifted, a pride blooming slow, a proof he wasn't the trash they'd labeled him, a mark made without their breath, a win carved in quiet, a scar they'd never soothe. The TV beckoned, a spot on Rise and Grind, a morning show with glaring lights and plastic ferns. The host, a bubbly blonde in a pastel suit, mic pinned tight. Ryan Carter, the genius of outreach, her voice a chirp, the studio audience clapping, a spotlight nailing him to a cushioned seat. He'd rehearsed this, answers polished, how he'd coded solo, how it worked, why it mattered. But she leaned close, grin wide. "Your family must be bursting with pride, huh?" A question that struck like a fist, the air thinning, his chest locking, the studio blurring, his mind reeling back to that night, snow on his sleeves. His mom's averted gaibam, his dad's hand on the lock, a family that didn't blink as he faded into the cold. He faltered, breath snagging, then forced a smile, bitter and thin, eyes drifting. "I wouldn't know." A sidestep, a truth, a silence that stretched, the host stammering, "Oh, well, you've done it all on your own." Her pivot shaky, the crowd rustling. A moment raw, unpolished, a pain he wouldn't spill, a hole they couldn't mend. He'd trudge back to his office, the city's clamor a muted drone, that smile slipping, the plaque cold under his touch. A success that shone but didn't warm, a life rebuilt without them, a height that left him bare. He'd made it CEO at 25, a name in bold print, a force they'd never fathom. Yet the wound lingered, a gash beneath the polish, a Christmas specter in every jingle. A family he'd outstrip but couldn't shake, a victory they'd never share, a strength they'd never match. He'd scroll the app's reviews past midnight, coffee cooling on the desk. "You gave me a chance. I'm working now." Words from strangers who saw him, who leaned on him, a family stitched from code, a home rooted in users, not blood, a purpose they'd never graze, a win they'd never clutch. The gala lights dimmed, the headlines stacked, his inbox pinged offers, accolades, a world at his doorstep. But he'd sit alone, the office still, the skyline vast beyond the glass, his reflection stark. A man who'd risen from frost and refusals, a boy they'd discarded now soaring, a success they'd never taste. He'd run his thumb along the plaque's edge, its weight solid, their weight heavier, a past he'd hauled through every script, every sleepless night, a pain he'd tucked beneath every award, a smile he'd flashed for lenses, not them, a life they'd disowned now blazing, a tale they'd never spin, a victory he'd seized solo, a wound they'd dealt still aching, a man they'd lost now whole, a silence they'd sown now is thrown. Ryan scrolled through his phone one December evening, the Columbus skyline a muted glow beyond his apartment window, the hum of his startup's success a steady undercurrent. 10 years since that snowy exile, a life rebuilt far from the family that had cast him out. The holidays loomed, a season he'd learned to brace for memories of that Christmas night, his dad's bellow, his mom's silence. A door slammed shut, but this year brought a jolt, a text from an old friend. "You need to see this," a link to his sister's Instagram, a post that stopped his breath. There it was, a family photo, pristine under a glittering tree, his dad stern in a sweater, his mom with a forced smile, his little sister beaming, and him, Ryan, photoshopped in, his face lifted from some old shot, pasted beside them like he'd never been erased, a lie glowing on the screen, a punch that stole the air from his lungs. He stared, the phone trembling in his grip, the image sharp as jawline, his eyes, a ghost slotted into their holiday cheer. The tree decked with ornaments he'd once hung, the fireplace he'd once stoked, a scene so familiar it ached, so false it burned. No call, no apology, no whisper of the night they'd thrown him to the snow, Just this, a digital stitch, a pretense they'd kept him all along. A family portrait scrubbed of truth, a betrayal dressed in tinsel and lights. His pulse raced, a heat rising, not sadness, not shock, but rage, a raw, searing thing. A decade of silence shattered by their gall, a claim they dared to stake, a wound they dared to gloss. A boy they'd disowned, now a prop in their frame. A story they'd rewritten without his voice. A hypocrisy he couldn't swallow. His inbox pinged, a message from his mom, the first in years. "We've always loved you, Ryan, but some things aren't easy to show. Hope you understand." Her words a thin thread, a plea draped in excuse, a love she claimed but never gave, a dodge that fueled the fire in his chest, a flimsy bridge he wouldn't cross. He paced his apartment, the hardwood creaking under his boots, the tree he hadn't bothered to decorate a shadow in the corner. Her text a taunt, love hidden when he'd starved, love silent when he'd begged, love now offered when he'd built a life without it, a love too late, too hollow, too tied to their shame, a love he didn't need. He stopped, fists clenched, the photo glaring back, their smiles a mask, his face a trophy they'd dusted off, a lie he'd tear apart, a truth he'd shout, a reckoning they'd forced with their charade. He opened his laptop, fingers flying, a post spilling out, "You don't get to flaunt me as a prize after wiping me from your lives." His words raw, unfiltered, a decade of hurt pouring onto the screen. "I slept in snow while you sang carols. I built myself while you looked away. And now you Photoshop me in. That's not love, it's cowardice." He hit publish, the words flying into the void. A viral spark, thousands of likes, shares, comments igniting, "Call them out. They don't deserve you." A chorus of strangers seeing what his family wouldn't. A storm he'd unleashed. A truth they couldn't dodge. A post that trended by morning. A spotlight on their deceit. A voice they'd silenced now roaring. A defiance they couldn't mute. A wound they'd dealt now bared. He sat back, the screen aglow, the city's hum, a dull pulse beyond the glass. His breath steadying, the post a weight lifted, a line drawn, a claim rejected. They'd disowned him, left him to freeze, and now they wanted his shine, his success, a piece of the man they'd discarded, a trophy for their card, a son for their show, not their heart. He'd read her text again. "Hope you understand," a plea he didn't know, a hope he didn't grant, a love he didn't buy, a family he'd outgrown, a lie he'd shred, a past he'd bury. The tree stood bare, the apartment still, his phone buzzing friends, followers. A world that saw him, a world they'd never join, a fury that settled into resolve, a strength they'd never sap. They decorated their tree, their tale, with a face they'd erased, a truth they'd deleted, a son they'd lost, a man they'd never know, a fight they'd never win, a voice they'd never still. Ryan stood in the sterile glow of a Columbus hospital hall. The beep of machines, a faint hum through the glass. 11 years since that snowy Christmas ejection. His life a fortress built far from the family that disowned him. His mom's call had come that morning, voice frail. "Your dad's dying, Ryan. He's asking for you." A plea that landed heavy, a crack in the wall he'd raised, a pull he couldn't dodge. He drove in silence, the city fading to suburbs, then the old hospital near their town, his boots echoing on linoleum, his chest tight as he reached the ICU door, peering through his dad, frail, tubes snaking from his arms, eyes sunken, lips moving. "Ryan," a whisper he caught, a name he hadn't heard from that mouth since the night it cursed him out, a call he'd never thought would come, a man who'd erased him now, reaching, a shadow of the titan who'd cast him away. He froze, hands pressed to the glass, the sight a storm. His dad's stern face softened by pain, his mom hunched beside, her eyes red, searching the hall, a scene he'd buried under a decade of steel, a wound he'd patched with success, a past he'd vowed to leave. She saw him, a gasp, a step toward the door, but he turned back to the wall, breath shallow. "No," a murmur to himself, a choice hardening, a line he wouldn't cross. They'd tossed him out, photoshopped him in, and now they wanted him back. A son for their grief, not their love. A claim he wouldn't grant, a reunion he wouldn't give. He walked away, her sob echoing, "Ryan, please." A cry he let fade, the hospital shrinking in his rear view, a father dying with his name, a mother begging too late, a family he'd outlived, a tie he'd cut, a door he'd shut for good. He returned to his apartment, the city's lights a quiet pulse, the sting of that hall still sharp, but his resolve sharper. He wouldn't bend, wouldn't break, wouldn't bow to their need, a need they'd never shown when he'd starved, when he'd built, when he'd risen. Christmas neared, and he turned it his own, hauling a tree into his loft, its branches bare until hands joined. Friends from the margins, gay and proud, clients from outreach, faces he'd lifted from their own shadows, voices he'd heard when his kin went deaf. They strung lights, hung ornaments, mismatched. Bright a chorus of laughs, a clink of mugs, a warmth he'd forged, a family he'd chosen, not born, a home they'd never touch, a holiday they'd never taint, a life they'd never claim. He stood back, the tree aglow, Ben from the shop days tossing tinsel, Maria from his app team humming carols, a client he'd placed at a bakery pouring cocoa, their chatter a balm, their presence a shield, a Christmas his own, a triumph they'd never see. He scrawled a note, pinned it to his board, "You don't get to claim me when I've already claimed myself." A creed whispered to the night, a truth carved in every bulb, every laugh, a strength they'd never sap, a past they'd never rewrite. He'd been their son, their shame, their ghost, and now he was none of it, a man who'd walked from their call, a soul who'd built his own, a heart they'd lost, a victory they'd never share, a holiday they'd never know. The night deepened, the loft alive, the city a backdrop to his peace, their photo a memory he'd burned, their plea a win he'd let pass, a son they'd disowned now free, a claim they'd lost forever. He'd stood at that glass, seen their end, and chosen his beginning, a tree lit by hands that stayed, a family that saw, a life that was his, a Christmas reclaimed, a man unbroken, a story complete. Who's tried to reclaim you too late? Tell us below. If Ryan's fight moves you, hit that like, share with the Disowned, and subscribe to Heart Stories. Tap that bell.